Today, I want to take a break from old racing games and unfinished operating systems to talk about one of my all-time favorite indie games, Tiny and Big in Grandpa's Leftovers. This is a cartoony 3D platformer from 2012. It was the first game released by German developer Black Pants Studio, and is one of the most unique 3D platformers I've ever played. Now, this video is going to be full of both gameplay and story spoilers, so if you care about that kind of thing and you have not played Tiny and Big before, I would recommend doing so before watching the rest of this video. The game is $10 full price on Steam and GOG, and it goes on sale pretty often. It can be beaten in around 2 hours, so there isn't much reason not to play it if anything I say here sounds interesting. Normally I'd start one of these videos by talking about gameplay or development history or something, but before we go any further, I need to address this art style, because this game absolutely hits you in the face with it. Tiny and Big uses heavily stylized cel-shaded graphics to achieve a goofy comic book aesthetic, and the result looks absolutely amazing. It's not just the shaders and lighting either. The texture work here is extremely well done, especially on the character models. All the fine details are drawn with black ink lines, including the characters' faces, which are all 2D animated. With the flat shading, it can be difficult to tell from a distance what's actually modeled and what's just a texture. This game has somewhat limited graphical fidelity for reasons that will become apparent shortly, and the art style does a fantastic job of hiding that fact. Personally, I consider Tiny and Big in Grandpa's Leftovers to be up there with the likes of Okami, No More Heroes, and Jet Set Radio when it comes to timeless video game art styles. It's that good. Of course, a great art style only gets a game so far, so let's get into gameplay. Tiny and Big starts off with a tutorial level that's cleverly contextualized as an in-universe handheld game. First, we're introduced to basic platforming. The movement and jumping controls are a tad stiff, but overall they're responsive and work just fine, which is more than I can say for some games I've played on this channel. Next, we're introduced to the 3 other core mechanics that Tiny and Big uses, and I'm actually going to go through these a little out of order from how they're presented. To start with, there's the grapple, which lets you grab and pull objects from a distance. Very useful for moving around platforms. Then there are the rockets, which serve the opposite purpose. They stick to any surface you shoot them at, and firing again activates the rocket to push objects away. The rockets don't grant much control over where things end up, so they're mostly useful for clearing out obstacles quickly, or when there isn't much room to maneuver. Finally, we have the laser. The laser is the best thing in this entire game. It is the backbone, the mechanical core which everything else is built around. Because the laser does this. Yup, the laser cuts clean through things, and there's no practical limit to the amount of tiny pieces you can cut something into. All the pieces it creates become their own independent physics objects that can be pushed and pulled around with the grapple and rockets. This simple set of mechanics is extremely satisfying and can lead to some insanely cool gameplay situations. There's a huge range to the size of objects you can cut apart. You start out slicing up boulders, and by the end of the game you'll be turning entire rock faces into piles of rubble. The ability to create on-the-fly geometry like this is super impressive for an indie game from 2012, and it's demanding enough to put Tiny and Big's system requirements on par with AAA titles of the time. If your system meets the recommended requirements though, this game will rarely, if ever, drop frames, even when cutting rocks into 100 tiny pieces. What's even more impressive though, is that this tech was developed entirely in-house at Black Pants Studio. This game runs on the Scape Engine, which is a custom game engine developed primarily by Black Pants Studio employee Johannes Spoor, a crazy talented dude who got his start doing demo scene stuff in the 90s, and who started work on the Scape Engine all the way back in 2002. I don't even have anything to add, really. I just can't get over how insanely ambitious this is for a small indie studio. After the tutorial, we get dropped into the game's first level, which is really more of a second tutorial. You have to run around and pick up all the gear that you just learned how to use. Getting each item requires you to use the ability granted by the previous one, and each objective is literally signposted. This is actually a good chance to discuss how this game displays text. It's all 3D rendered in the environment itself, and this game loves to throw out text like this in the form of comic book style sound effects. It looks surprisingly good. The effect does a great job adding to the overall aesthetic, but is still subtle enough that it can easily be ignored and rarely interferes with gameplay. As for the level itself, this is probably the weakest stage in the entire game. You're given this mid-sized open area to mess around in, but there isn't much reason to do so beyond getting to grips with the controls. The entire area can be easily cleared in under 2 minutes on a repeat playthrough, which is not great considering how short this game already is. There is an optional collectible way up on a cliff that takes some effort to grab, but it's difficult to see from most of the stage. I didn't spot it until I got up to the level exit, and had I taken 2 more steps, I'd have triggered a cutscene and lost my chance to go back and grab it. Honestly, this first area feels like a waste of a stage. Were this area more linear, with each key item separated by a small puzzle or platforming challenge, I think it would have held up much better. Before we go any further, now is probably a good time to talk about the controls. I used a keyboard and mouse when I first played this game back in 2013, and an Xbox One controller on the playthrough I did for this video. Neither control method is completely ideal. A controller is probably the better experience overall, but there's a lack of aim assist. Now, the game doesn't require you to be super accurate or anything, but you can still miss your target from time to time. There also isn't a button to center the camera behind the player character, which can lead to some frustrating moments during tense platforming sequences. A keyboard and mouse is much better for aiming, but 3D platforming with a keyboard is awful. This game is also designed around a 3-button mouse, with each button being tied to one of your tools. In most cases, that means the rockets will be bound to the center mouse wheel, which is a little awkward. The hypothetical ideal control setup for this game is a Wii nunchuck or other similar one-handed analog controller to handle the movement and platforming controls, paired with an old-school 3-button mouse for aiming and shooting. Unfortunately, I don't have the necessary hardware to try this setup for myself, but if anyone out there who does would like to try it out and let me know how it goes, please leave a comment down below. The second stage is where this game actually gets good. You have to climb up a giant cliff with an ancient temple built into the face. It's a pretty long level with several hidden areas and multiple paths. This level introduces the first real puzzles with these beams that need to be strategically cut down to cross gaps, and pillars that need to be cut out of the way to make certain jumps. There's also a section where you have to slice through a long series of blocks that pulls the camera back to this hilarious reveal when you make it to the end. When you finally make it to the top floor of the temple, you get to pull open this giant door, which might be one of the most satisfying moments in the entire game. Then it's on to the next level. The third stage is where the action starts to pick up a bit more, and it's here that I need to take a bit of an aside to discuss the story. As you may have guessed from the title, this game concerns the characters Tiny and Big. Tiny being the player character, and Big being the antagonist. The game starts off in medias res, at the beginning of what, in most stories, would be the second act. Tiny has just set out on a journey to recover his grandpa's magical underpants from Big, who we're told stole them before the start of the game. The way this is all presented is really interesting, because the game doesn't really take time to establish any of these characters or their motivations before jumping straight into the action. You can easily miss what little backstory there is here if you don't sit through all the dialogue on the title screen before starting the game. Everything is framed as though these characters are of an established franchise that the audience is already familiar with, despite only ever being featured in this one game and its demo. It's even called Tiny and Big in Grandpa's Leftovers, as though this were a single entry in a running series instead of a standalone release. Lead artist and Black Pants CEO Sebastian Stam does have experience in the comics industry, so I'm not really sure if Tiny and Big was meant to be spun off into a larger franchise, or if this is like Buckaroo Banzai, where the implication of an established canon is supposed to be part of the joke. Either way, it gives the story a weird, disconnected tone that I haven't experienced elsewhere in gaming. The reason I bring this all up now is because the third stage is where Tiny finally catches up to Big, and the two have their first real fight. You have to platform over this bridge while Big uses the power of the underpants to hurl stuff at you with telekinesis. You have to either dodge his incoming attacks, or cut through the things he throws before they can hit you, until you get close enough to cut through the platform that he's standing on, which forces him to move further away. It's a lot to juggle, and I died quite a few times trying to get through this section. The biggest issue is that your laser cuts through things very slowly, far too slowly to cut through incoming projectiles in real time. The game compensates for this by slowing them down to a crawl when you initiate a cut with the laser. The problem is that if you initiate a cut and aren't aiming directly at whatever is hurling towards you, then it doesn't slow down, and you'll get crushed while cutting through a random rock 20 feet away. Even if you do hit your target though, cutting through incoming projectiles doesn't always work. There's always a chance that you'll slice a boulder perfectly in two, and it will still pummel you straight into the ground. This is a pretty tricky stretch of gameplay, and thankfully checkpoints are frequent enough that it doesn't get too frustrating. After making it across the bridge, you confront Big in a large circular arena. This section is much easier than the one before it. He hops between a series of pillars, and you can cut most of them out from under him before he gets a chance to throw anything. Even when he does, his attacks are much easier to dodge now that you're not confined to a narrow path. After cutting down all the pillars, the level has one final section that's similar to the first, except now you're chasing Big uphill. The path here gives you more room to maneuver, but it's harder to see and anticipate incoming attacks. The toughest bit in the whole level is right here, where you have to slowly pull down a beam to climb up to a higher platform, while being bombarded by attacks that you can't always see coming. After that, it's just a quick run up the stairs to the level exit. The fourth stage is probably the best overall showcase for Tiny and Big's unique set of mechanics. You have to climb your way up to the top of this giant pyramid, which requires pushing, pulling, and cutting your way through obstacles, and eventually the pyramid itself. This level can take a while to complete, and it was here that I really started wishing the grapple had a way to reel things in from a standstill, instead of making you walk backwards in order to pull things. Once again, there are several side areas that require clever use of the game's mechanics to get into. Towards the end of the level, you have to start cutting ramps into the walls of the pyramid in order to keep climbing up it, and the game never explicitly tells you to do this. You have to figure it out for yourself. Looking at a giant wall and realizing you can cut through it diagonally to make a ramp is easily one of the best aha moments in the entire game. It's a bit of a reaction time challenge too, as clearing out the upper parts of the wall can easily get you crushed to death if you stand in the wrong place for too long. When you finally make it to the top of the pyramid, there's another fight with Big waiting for you. This one is the easiest yet. Mechanically, it's the same as the fight from the middle of the previous level, but now Big is standing on a series of small floating platforms instead of giant pillars. These platforms are super quick to cut through, so if you move fast and have good aim, you can take them all out before he even has a chance to attack. After defeating Big for a second time, we descend into the pyramid for the final stretch of the game. The vibe of this level is completely different to the ones that came before it. We've encountered this dark blue and purple color palette earlier, in small caves and building interiors, but these sections have been brief up until now, and always set against the backdrop of a bright sunny desert. The inside of the pyramid is much darker than any of these previous areas, with the only major light source for most of the level being the eerie glow of the inscriptions on the pyramid walls. Unfortunately, the dark, foreboding atmosphere falls apart somewhat due to the way the game handles its music. All the background tracks in this game are diegetic. Throughout the game, you collect cassette tapes, which each contain a piece of background music. All the tracks you've collected are perpetually played on a loop via the portable radio Tiny carries with him. By the way, the radio is also sentient, and it talks to you and acts as your guide throughout the game. I forgot to mention that earlier. Anyway, the diegetic music, as much as I love the system, doesn't really work well for the inside of the pyramid. All the tracks, while memorable and extremely well produced for a small indie game, are largely upbeat pieces that don't really fit the oppressive mood the rest of this level was going for. This pyramid level is the single longest stage in the game, and it's unique in that instead of climbing a structure, most of your time is spent descending into the pyramid. The gimmick of this stage, if you can really call it that, is these underpants-shaped blocks that you have to slide into the appropriate holes on the floor in order to open doors. Finding these keys and getting them where they need to go is the trickiest part of the level, often frustratingly so. It can be quite the challenge to drag these things up ramps at an awkward angle. This level does start to get a tad repetitive by the end, but it stops short of becoming overlong and tedious. I think the game gets away with it though, as this is the lead up to the final boss in an otherwise very brief title. The pace is also broken up a bit about halfway down the pyramid, where you can find a bonus stage in the form of an arcade cabinet tucked into the corner. I completely missed this back when I first played this game, so it was neat to discover on this playthrough. There might be more bonus stages in other levels, but if there are, I haven't found them. On this playthrough, I was going for every collectible I could find, and this was the only one I came across. After pulling, cutting, and jumping your way to the bottom of the pyramid, you'll encounter the most needlessly frustrating part of this entire game. First, we need to talk about the slides. I love the awkward half-crouch you do as you slide down these things, but that's beside the point. The approach to the final boss with Big has you slide down one of these into the final boss arena. The cutscene triggers when you're about halfway down the slide, and after it plays out, the boss fight begins with Tiny standing on the ground below the slide. If you fail the boss fight, which is very likely to happen until you figure out what to do, the game replays this opening cutscene. All of Tiny and Big's cutscenes are rendered in real time in-engine, so the game has to teleport Tiny's actual character model back onto the slide in order to replay it. This creates a problem, because while you can skip cutscenes in this game, doing so does not update the player character's position. If you skip this particular cutscene while Tiny is still on the slide, he somehow ends up clipping through it, and then you immediately fall into a bottomless pit to your death. You have to wait a good 7 seconds for the first bit of this cutscene to play out every single time you die to the boss, or else you instantly die and have to wait for it all over again. A game-breaking bug like this is a massive oversight. I can see this being missed in the original release due to the small size of the dev team. The game is a little rough around the edges in other spots, but I'm surprised this hasn't been patched out in an update after almost 9 years. This seems like the type of thing that should be pretty easy to fix, and there's no way I'm the first person to encounter this bug. As for the boss fight itself, it's a twist on the other fights you've had with Big, and like I said, can take a few tries to get through. Big still throws projectiles at you that need to be sliced through or dodged, but now he throws 2 at a time and more frequently. You have to cut apart these 3 pillars surrounding his throne in order to push out the glowing blocks they contain and break the floor beneath him. His attacks don't give you much time to do that, though, so the trick is to run around behind each pillar where he can't hit you and cut them apart. Once you figure that out, this fight becomes a cakewalk. After destroying the pyramid, Tiny and Big fall into a void where they have one final battle amongst random pieces of debris. This fight is pretty easy, especially compared to the last one. You just have to cut the floating platforms out from under him again. The hardest part is the second phase, where Big starts throwing massive sections of wall at you that can't be dodged, and will just barely miss you if you cut through them in time. This is a suitably epic final encounter. This fight, and the one before it, actually have dedicated music tracks, which definitely helps keep the tension up when compared with the rest of the game. At the end of the fight, you defeat Big once and for all by dropping a boulder on him in an appropriately cartoony fashion. We then get shown the final cutscene, where it's revealed that Tiny's grandpa was also Big's grandpa, meaning that the two are brothers, or at the very least cousins. This reveal isn't really treated as a reveal at all, though, as if the writers assume we already know this, further adding to the implication of an established storyline that doesn't actually exist. After that, a gopher, I think, steals the underpants, and the two walk off into the sunset while the credits roll. So that's Tiny and Big in Grandpa's Leftovers. One of the most unique 3D platformers I've ever played, and a game that I think deserves way more recognition than it has. This game has only sold around 2.9 million copies on Steam, and while that's nothing to scoff at, it pales in comparison to the 5 to 10 million Steam sales seen by other well-polished indie games from around the same time. Those numbers look even worse when you factor in console sales, because Tiny and Big is a PC exclusive. It just can't compete when you add everything up. Given the small development team and custom engine, I'm not surprised that this game didn't get a console port on release. I doubt the aging console hardware of the time would have handled it very well anyway. Though it's a shame it hasn't found its way onto newer platforms in the time since. This would be a great fit for something like the Switch, and I imagine a 3D platformer would have broader appeal among a console audience than it does among the PC one. While Tiny and Big wasn't a complete flop, I think it's telling that Black Pants Studio hasn't ever revisited this particular subgenre, especially considering how much potential this game leaves open for a sequel, and I'm disappointed we never got one. That being said, I'm pretty happy with the game we did get. I'd much rather have a tightly focused, short game that leaves you wanting more, than a long, meandering one that overstays its welcome, as so many AAA releases tend to do. And if you do want more, there is at least one more morsel in the form of a proof-of-concept demo that was released in 2010, called Tiny and Big in Up the Mountain. It's not as polished as the finished product, but you do get one additional level featuring this same set of mechanics, and it's free on itch.io, so you can't really complain. I think that's just about all I have to say. If you like 3D platformers and you haven't played Tiny and Big and Grandpa's Leftovers, go give it a shot. Hey, thanks for watching this video. This channel recently passed 500 subscribers, so big thanks to everyone out there who's already subscribed. That's a pretty big milestone. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, I encourage you to do so. Also like, leave a comment, all that other good stuff. And I think that's everything. Bye!